Fascinating talk, and so thanks to the organisers as well. I have a political comment and an academic question.
Yeah, sure.
The political comments, it looks like neoclassical economics to me isn't leading to the extinction of capitalism, and that what you say quite rightly is it might lead to the extinction of the species, and so I'm wondering if perhaps the extinction of capitalism is something that we should maybe hope for, but that's maybe a political discussion beyond the scope of this talk. My academic question, which is much more specific, is about sort of accounting conventions in your models. So I study the history of accounting and the importance of accounting conventions in the history department. Yeah. So like you, I'm having to learn accounting from the outside.
Yep.
I've seen you in other talks talk about the importance of incorporating double-entry bookkeeping into your models.
Yep.
So I'd be interested to hear about that. And you also said in your talk about growth being... I'll have to check my notes. The rise of productivity minus depreciation. Sorry, investment minus depreciation.
Yeah.
And so I'm interested in that because depreciation, as I understand it, is an accounting convention that can be done in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that?
The simple thing I'm doing in depreciation really saying machines wear out, and effectively technological change makes them obsolete as well. So that it's not really an accounting convention for depreciation I'm using there. It's in those models are strictly physical depreciation. Okay. And you asked about double-entry bookkeeping. Well, that was an intriguing thing for me to learn, because when I first started building these models, I was using the approach I've shown you before, the set of differential equations. And what I was building on was Goodwins' growth model. So if you look back in the literature in 1967, a wonderful American mathematical non-orthodox economist called Richard Goodwin wrote what is effectively a birthday present for Karl Marx. In 1967, 100 years after Capital was first published, he put into mathematical form a verbal model of cycles in Chapter 1 of Capital. And this verbal model was something just out of the blue. I mean, most of Capital, Marx assumed wages were constant and equal to subsistence. But in a few paragraphs he talked about wages varying and the rate of accumulation and the rate of profit and rate of wages, and finished up by saying, to put it mathematically, the rate of accumulation is the independent, not the dependent variable. The rate of wages is the dependent, not the independent variable. And I thought it was a brilliant foundation for building a model of Minsky. So I took that and I added debt into the whole thing, and then I went. And over time I realised that in fact you could derive Goodwin's equations by simply differentiating the wages share of GDP and the employment rate. And then it occurred to me, what about the debt ratio? Yeah, same thing. So I worked out the stuff I've shown you now. So I'm now going backwards and saying Goodwin actually got the core nature of capitalism right. The one thing he left out was the banking sector. Okay? And his reason for leaving the banking sector out, I know personally because he wrote to me about it. And ironically, he did a statistical study which convinced him money had no impact, looking at data between the First and Second World War. But he's also told me his grandfather had a bank that went bankrupt in the Great Depression. And he had to pay out all the depositors, and the family went bankrupt as well. So he didn't put the personal and the political together. So he advised me not to include money in my modelling. I thanks very much, but I'm going to ignore that advice. I'm glad I did. But anyway, back to the double-entry bookkeeping. I then understood Graziani's approach to money. So I wanted to bring monetary modelling into my mathematics, but I realised I had to use double-entry bookkeeping to do it. Single-entry bookkeeping I was doing initially, which you can do. It's possible to have single-entry. And then over time I just realised that double-entry is actually how money is created. It's just a double-entry operation. There's some great books on the history of money. There's an accounting. There's one called Double-Entry by a woman called, I can't drag a name out of the back of my brain, Gleason White, Jane Gleason White. Goes back to what's the accountant's name in Italy, Pinch? P something.
Yes.
Yeah.
I know exactly who you mean.
Yeah. So it was invented in the 1500s roughly in Venice, and then it spread around the world. But it was still, the banks were creating money in some ways before then, but this made it much more systematic. So what Minsky does is let you have, as you can see, I've got lending increasing the assets and increasing liabilities over here, repayment reducing. I've got some cases where we have got wages reducing one liability and increasing another. You're seeing that in terms of minus and plus, but you can have debits and credits as well. Okay, it's just an option in Minsky. I find the debits and credits really hard to follow, so I just use the plus and minus. We took a couple of years to get the logic right on that front, but now it's correct. And now what we do, if you want to build a Minsky model, like I'll just quickly show you if I start from scratch and I bring in a bank, just bring a bank icon down here, open up the Godly table for it, make it a bit larger so you can see what's going on. If I want to have, say if I have reserves, I'll just use R for reserves, L for loans. I've typed in one of your columns, I'll just delete that column, and then say F for firms, and W for workers, and B for bank equity. And then if I have, for example, I type, say, lend money, then I'm going to have, say, lend here, and increase lending over here. Now if I make a mistake in typing, then Minsky comes out here and says assets minus liabilities minus equity is not zero. So that row is not correct. So you've got to make an amendment. We're going to modify the table layout as well at some stage. I think I've got a couple of new ideas on how to do it. But then say let's repay, then you're going to have minus repay because you've got to take money out of your deposit account, and the bank will then show your debt has fallen. Interest payments, then if you've got to take interest money out of your account and it gets paid to the bank, and then let's say you hire workers, so you have wages. I'll leave that. That's just at the moment it's just a label. We don't make any other use of it. So wages coming out of here and going to the workers, and then if the bank consuming, then I might have consumption by bankers. That's going to give me an underscore here. Well, they pay the money to the firm sector, and then if I had consumption by workers, then I'm going to have consumption coming out of their account and going into the firm's account. Now, can anybody see a differential equation there? What you're actually doing is defining a set of differential equations, and Minsky's making sure they're consistent, and it can handle an enormous level of complexity now. So this is done by a master's student who's now since started his PhD with me. I'll just bring it up. It's a horror to look at, and what we're doing now with a grant from the Friends Provident Foundation is we're drastically improving the usability of the program. So a whole lot of the stuff that's absolutely unreadable here is going to go onto a separate tab. Okay, but that's a model of the Portuguese economy. Now all this stuff here are definitions. Let's look at the financial sector. All that is based on the actual national accounts. And so by carefully filling out all the national account operations and then doing some regressions to fit the data, he's built a model of Portugal which is more accurate than the model the central bank or the Treasury use, because they're doing neoclassical models that don't include banks, debt and money. Okay. So the idea is to make this an engine for large-scale monetary macroeconomic modelling. Long answer to your question. I hope that's okay? Yeah. I've got to ask a question. How did you break your ankle?
I had a football match last week.
Huh?
I had a football match last week.
Oh dear. Okay. It's one of the reasons I play tennis, non-contact sport. Okay.
How did you break yours? You said you broke yours.
In the factory accident,
Okay.
with a forklift truck, getting a hand-operated forklift truck, pushing my foot against a crate of bottles of wine. Yeah, it wasn't pleasant. Yeah.
If neoclassical models are not able to predict empirical evidence or what is actually happening in the real world, why do people stick to them?
It's a religion. Fundamentally, the people who've been trained in this stuff, their minds have been so used to thinking this way that they can't really think any other way. And I think it also starts off with a sense of zealotry. I remember believing this stuff when I was doing it in high school, when I first learned it. And what you get, and I'll use this analogy as walking up here, it's like an intricate Swiss watch. Okay, you've got, and everything is correct about the world. Everything is right in the world. So you have equilibrium, very important ontological concept. People get what they deserve. The marginal productivity theory of income distribution. It's all like clockwork, and just like a clock, if you take one set of gears out of the clock, it doesn't work. Okay, So the whole thing ties together. And if you challenge any bit, bang, it's all gone. So consequently, people believe it describes a perfect mechanism, like a perfect Swiss watch. And they want to make the world like a perfect Swiss watch. And then when any challenge comes to them, they simply can't accept any challenge because any part being removed, the whole thing malfunctions. Yeah. You're not sure?
It's kind of confusing to me because I don't do economics at all. I do physics.
Yeah, excellent.
Physics,
Good stuff.
We also have beautiful models which are like working like clockwork, but they don't predict the reality at all. They're just beautiful, like in mathematical.
Well, you're thinking of string theory.
For example.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's so most people reject them in terms of like the science community.
Yeah.
Because you can't make predictions. All predictions are wrong. It's like why should you even read on it as a research community?
It is weird. I mean, like physics, at least, like in physics, you learn in the first year of a physics course that quantum mechanics and relativity are in conflict. You're pretty much told that there's a Nobel Prize and God knows what else if you can resolve that dilemma. In economics, they just gloss over all this stuff. So if you look at the economics textbook, for example, and look at them where they have data on a firm, you'll find people like Minsky have got things like Lizzie's Lolly Shop or Bruce's bathtubs, etc., with made-up numbers. There's no actual empirical data in there. The reason being, they don't actually know this, but if they went to get the empirical data from a firm, it would contradict their theory. So rather than being full of experimental results and fundamental constants and so on, it's full of these toy models. But people's minds get built around thinking that way, and it's again with neural networks. When you train a neural network on a particular set of data, its structure reproduces the data fundamentally. And then if you hit it with a completely different set of data, you're just going to scramble all the numbers, and its structure will have to totally change as well. I think in that sense, once you've swallowed this stuff, it's very, very hard to think about the world any other way. And so they automatically reject anything which is critical, whether it doesn't fit the theory, data that doesn't fit the theory, or opposing theory, they just reject it. And you can't get into their heads. Yeah.
I guess my question is, what does, say, a government policymaker do with this information? So once we've modeled an economy where we have, say, money as a crucial factor, where we have a banking system which creates money, what do I, as a prospective, say, government policy maker, do with this information? Where do I go with it?
Well, for a start, you'd be adding private debt and credit as essential indicators of the economy's health. Okay? So you'd be looking at the level of private debt and looking at the level of credit. And whenever it gets too high, and currently I think the level of debt's probably 3 times what it should be, 2 or 3 times, private debt, then you'd be bringing in controls to limit the level of lending, targeting lending. The one thing I haven't got actually ready for you, but I'll load it quickly because this was probably the most remarkable chart for me when I did my book, Can We Avoid Another Financial Crisis? And I'll just have to see if I've got, okay, I have to load a file here. Pardon me, stuffing around a bit. I think my program's freezing here. I'm getting not responding, which is often a product of Windows rather than the program. So I'll bring up the book and just see if I can bring up that particular chart. Pardon me, making a bit of a fist of the presentation here. Paging through. I'll know when to stop. I'm praying I've actually got the chart in it. Let's see, here we go. Come on. Okay, that is the UK's private debt to GDP ratio and credit. And this is data from the Bank of England. And what it shows is that before Maggie Thatcher, the level of private debt in the UK never exceeded 73% of GDP, from 1880 all the way out to 1982. Maggie gets in charge, and 2 years later, I think the most important mistake she made was deregulating the housing finance of the housing sector. She enabled banks to move in where building societies were only allowed to lend beforehand. Now, building societies are loanable funds institutions. They loan out of an account they have at a bank, and they've got to have it topped up by depositors. That's why they've got time limits in building societies, and you get withdrawing money and so on. So there's no money creation, and therefore no asset inflation until after the deregulation, and then that's under her and that's under Blair. So I would have, if you had a post-Keynesian policy advisor unaware of the role of money, there would have been limits saying that's obviously the ceiling level of debt we should allow in the economy. Anything above it, no. Controls come in, limitations on where you can lend to, debt abolition, debt jubilees, etc., etc. And a lot of other policies as well, but that's the most obvious one to me. Yeah. Yep.
I've heard you talk about that we are well underway for another crisis, that it should be due. What can you elaborate on, like what your simple models are?
Okay, you notice the bottom line down there is credit. Now let's make it a bit larger again, if they can see it more clearly. And notice that credit was very, very strongly positive before the 1990s, and then very positively stronger before the global financial crisis. It's very, very weak since then. So what you're in the aftermath to a debt bubble, a debt-induced crisis, and in the aftermath, banks aren't particularly willing to lend money, and borrowers aren't particularly willing to take on debt. So what you've got is a low level of credit demand, lower than was obviously the trend back here, but even lower than some times back in the past. So what you've got is sluggish aggregate demand. And to have a crisis, what you have to have is booming aggregate demand followed by a plunge. So I don't expect a crisis for the UK or America. I do expect one for Australia and Canada and a few others that continued borrowing massively during the financial crisis and didn't have a downturn then. They've got far higher levels of debt now. So like the Canadian and Australian debt levels are up here somewhere. So they're likely to have a crisis, but not the UK, not the USA, not most of Europe. They're more likely having what I call credit stagnation. A neoclassical economist called Larry Summers talks about secular stagnation. That's nonsense. Secular stagnation blames low economic growth on parents not having enough babies and engineers not having enough ideas, not their fault of economists. To me, it's the credit system not providing sufficient credit when you actually need it. Credit's actually a useful factor, particularly for entrepreneurs or for firms with working capital or households buying large items like cars and so on, and genuine accommodation rather than speculating on houses. You need credit for that. If it's tight, you've got very inflexible aggregate demand and the economy will grow slowly. So that's the situation I think we face until climate change wipes us out. Yeah.
I've got two very different questions. One, I'm interested in the concept of monetary sovereignty. Or
Speak up a bit so I can hear you.
Sorry, yeah.
Monetary sovereignty?
Yeah, or the lack of monetary sovereignty in certain countries in the global south. Just your comments on the role of that and how your models take that.
I'll answer that one and go to the other two, because people ask me three questions like this, I always forget number one. Okay.
The other one was shorter. I wondered on your thoughts on the future of the dollar as the global reserve currency.
So, what I thought about what?
The role of the US dollar going forward.
Keynes, one of Keynes's neglected statements, was one of my engineering friends pointed out to me, was above all else let finance be national. He was against having international finance, and he also was in favour of controls on the scale of deficits and trade surpluses and trade deficits by having an international currency called the Bancor, which would be issued relative to the size of national economies, trade in a fixed exchange rate to national currencies, and if you started running low, then you have to depreciate your currency. But if you're accumulating a surplus, you are taxed on the surplus, and the surplus is used to finance development in the third world. So he was strongly of the opinion we should not have international finance, which of course is all we have these days, not to use a national currency, and to restrict trade deficits to no more than about 2% of GDP. Now we're in a world where they're running in some countries 10%. Surplus is certainly 10%. Germany was running that high, Japan, China, Korea, etc., etc. And that Keynes regarded surpluses as reducing aggregate demand, because a surplus country takes money out of a deficit country. You get a slowdown in economic growth courtesy of trade surpluses being too high. And so he wanted to control trade surpluses. And I agree with that. I think Keynes was correct about all that. And like monetary sovereignty, to me, is threatened if you have a large trade deficit, because then you're running out of domestic money. Not domestic money, you're finding you've got to issue bonds or sell assets in foreign currency. And over time, those liabilities will mean that you can have things like the George Soros run on your economy. Floating exchange rates reduce the danger of that, but they don't eliminate it, because we saw, for example, in Turkey recently, and we saw in Argentina as well. So monetary sovereignty is challenged by running trade deficits, but trade deficits are the mirror image of trade surpluses. Okay, one can cause the other. So I'd want to see controls and all. That makes me different to MMT, by the way. I think MMT is wrong on that particular point. Correct about domestic money creation and the role of the government, but wrong on monetary sovereignty. Yeah.
I just want to ask whether it's possible to factor in things like institutions.
Like what?
Institutions, in the way Asamoah and Robinson described extractive and inclusive. Would you be able to include these things in the models? Because surely they affect a lot of things like trusting the government and banks within the country, and then these lead to things like loss aversion, and they obviously affect investments.
Yeah,
and
loss aversion is overrated. I think I'd actually recommend you look at the work of O.A. Peters and what's called the Ergodicity Economics Group in London, because they're finding, I've never been a great fan of behavioural economics, because for a start their reference point is neoclassical definition of rationality. Well, according to neoclassicals, there have been two rational people in history. One was Jesus and the other is Nostradamus, because they define rationality as capacity to accurately predict the future. So, that's not rational, that's prophetic. And then if you're making that your reference point for what you call irrational behaviour, well, then anything is irrational compared to that. So I'm not a great fan of the behavioural. I don't oppose it. It's useful research in its own way. But when I see neoclassical economists listening to that stuff, I can just see their minds saying, oh, well, that's too complicated, let's stick with the seeming rational behaviour. They never incorporate it properly in their models. And in terms of institutions, the most obvious institution I would include is banking. Why don't they include banking as one of the institutions in a realistic way? But generally speaking, yes, anything you want to model. Minsky is a general modelling platform. It's not the post-Keynesian modelling. You can model the weather system in Minsky. It's a generic modelling tool. So if you can define an institution in terms of its dynamic relationship with other institutions, you can add that to the model. Yeah.
Would you say that your model structure answers the Lucas critique? So saying that your economy is capable of explaining policy changes and including.
Well, people respond to policy changes. And that's the model's obviously dynamic. So you just can add in more elements of dynamic responses to what other sectors are doing. But the Lucas critique is vastly overrated. There's actually been some very good empirical arguments against it, saying, well, just how much does it matter that people change their behaviour in response to policy versus the impact of policy? And if you see the original papers coming out of that, there were some that argued, for example, that because the public knows the policy objectives of the central bank, the government cannot fool the public for even one period by, for example, stimulating the economy. That's literally in some of the papers coming out of the Lucas critique. It was really all about trying to argue government can do nothing. And when you look at it empirically, I'm sorry if the government changes tax rates or changes spending, it changes people's behaviour today. They don't think, although like part of the Lucas critique ended up giving us what was called Ricardian equivalence. Okay, and like you look at some of the arguments these people come up with, and you basically think, I live in Amsterdam, and they don't sell stuff that strong in Amsterdam. Let's just see if I can find an example here. Barrow, probably my favourite one to loathe. Let's see, Ricardian approach to budget deficits. Now, if you think about the Lucas critique, that's partly like a piece of realism. Okay, we should be more realistic and respond to what people do. But it was actually used to justify nonsense like this. Okay, here we go. Okay. So here he is. What he's arguing is that people, if the government runs a deficit today, then people will respond to that by spending less because they know they've got to put aside money to pay taxes in the future. Now somebody said, well, what if people don't live forever? Radical thought, what if people die? Will that change their behaviour? And you said, this argument fails if a typical person is already giving to his or her children out of altruism. Now, since when was altruism an essential neoclassical concept to begin with? The main idea is the network of intergenerational transfers makes a typical person a part of extended family that goes on indefinitely. In this setting, households capitalise the entire array of expected future taxes and therefore plan effectively with an infinite future. What a load of bullshit. Okay? But that became part of neoclassical theory, courtesy of the Lucas critique. Realism? So
no, exactly. I agree with you. What came out of the Lucas critique was this stuff.
Pardon, sorry?
I agree with you that what came out of the Lucas critique was this stuff. The Lucas critique itself is an answer to the stagflation that we saw in the 70s.
Yeah.
That was not explained by the macro models that existed. As far as I understand.
Yeah, as far as they understand, because they never read Phillips in the first place. I mean, again, this is why one thing I emphasise in debunking economics is read the originals. Let's just take a look at Phillips here, because they. Here we go. This is the original. Let's see, where are we? This is the original Phillips curve paper here. And if you read the paper, you'll find that he says, he just talks about the wages responding to the employment rate. But then he says, the second factor, the rate of change of unemployment might also affect wage demands. Then he has a third, cost push inflation. Now if you actually included all that in your Phillips curve, you'd have a model which fits the entire phase space of the 1960s to 1970s. Because there was an oil price hike, 2 oil price hikes. There was huge wage demands with full employment, really full employment, leading up to 71, 72, 73. There was a debt crisis, which was completely missed by the neoclassical because they don't even look at the data. But the first major credit collapse occurred in 1973 to 75. So there are Minsky and post-Keynesian explanations of that the neoclassicals never read. They never read the originals. They read their own textbook versions. And they really were critiquing Samuelson, because if you look at the people like Lucas and co, they were rabidly anti-government. The Samuelsons at least had a role for government in his whole model. The whole agenda was to eliminate a role for government. So do take that stuff with not a grain of salt. Go and drink the North Sea. Then you've got enough salt to take that stuff in. Yeah.
My question is again about the sort of policy responses to this. So one of Minsky's killer lines is that stability is destabilising, and that you can't avoid sort of moving on to speculative and then Ponzi forms of financing. Mm-hmm. So is it possible with the correct models, in your opinion, to find the correct way of technically managing the economy to avoid serious crises, or is this a sort of inescapable part of
the main serious crisis we avoid is too much debt and then too much of a collapse in credit as a result of it. So if you have like the central bank actually looking at this data rather than just collecting it and saying debt levels are rising too fast, or there's too much debt in the society, we need to reduce the level of private debt. Just that you like to use QE to pump up the financial sector, they could use QE for the people to reduce private debt. So there are mechanisms that exist. They could actually stop having credit bubbles, enormous credit bubbles, and you also have to treat banks as institutions that deserve to be controlled, because banks aren't just like somebody didn't walk out onto a stage and say, just one more thing, I've invented a bank. They get a banking license. It comes with responsibilities as well as rights, and that's been completely ignored, and we treat them like they're God's gift to humanity, and they should tell us what to do. Banks should be constrained in who they can lend to and what they can lend for. You want banks to exist to finance real investment and real consumption. You don't want it financing speculation, gambling on asset prices, particularly when you can prove, as I've done, that level of credit actually is what drives the asset prices. You've got a positive feedback loop. I actually prefer an amplifying feedback loop between change in mortgage debt and change in house prices. So you want to stop house prices rising, stop banks lending more money for mortgages. That's the cause. So once you identify and say that they're a servant of society rather than the masters, then you can control what they can lend towards, force them to lend to the real economy, not for speculation in the financial sector, and be willing to write private debt off, because too much can be created even when you're watching controls, which of course they're not doing. Yeah?
Out of curiosity, if your model allowed for negative interest rates, how would it change?
Negative interest rates would reduce the level of debt. So it's a way of amortising debt effectively. It's not what they're trying to do with it. They're trying to stimulate consumption, because again, according to their models, debt doesn't matter. Okay. But a side effect of negative interest rates would be compounding effect, reducing debt rather than increasing it. So it could potentially be a stabilising mechanism, and that comes down to the whole question of what should money be? Because we talk about money being a unit of account, the store of value, and a means of payment. Now, the unit of account is obviously vitally necessary, but the store of value is in conflict with the means of payment. Because if you try to save money, you're hoarding it. You're spending it more slowly. If you want to have an economy being driven by monetary demand, you want money spent more quickly. So those two are in opposition with each other. And there was a proposal from a late 19th, early 20th century economist called Silvio Gesell to have depreciating money that actually depreciated if you didn't use it. Now, that was actually effectively the case with high inflation during the 60s and 70s, and that actually encouraged a higher level of spending. And that was actually used by a town called Borgel in Austria during the Great Depression to create its own artificial script in place of credit-based money. And that one economy got to full employment, that one town, very rapidly. So there are things we can change. Once you understand that money matters, then you can make changes to the nature of money, or consider making them, which would have a dramatic impact upon the economy. I think our host is looking worried about dinner time. Are we right?
Do we have to wrap up?
Okay.
Yes. I think so, yes.
All right.
So we have one more question?
Okay. Yeah.
One more question.
This might be a bit direct, but
So?
did you see the crisis coming?
Pardon?
Did you see the crisis coming?
Yeah. The long story is I was asked to do a expert witness case for a law case in Australia involving predatory lending. And as part of it, if you want to breach a loan contract and have a lawyer agree to being breached, or a judge, you've got to have a really strong reason. And one of the strong reasons is this contract has effects on people who are not parties to the contract, negative effects, so the contract shouldn't be enforced. So I started researching it in December 16, I think it was, 2005. And first thing I looked at was the private debt to GDP ratio. And I got the shock of my life when I had to bring together different series to look at it and change. One was in quarters, the other was in months. And my eyes popped out of my head, because I'd written a line saying that debt to GDP ratios have been rising exponentially. And as an expert, you can't use hyperbole. So I thought, well, I'll check the data. It'll be rising, but it won't be exponential, so I have to find another word. And then I took one look at this is Australian data, and I went, holy shit, that's exponential. I did a quick correlation coefficient they're both positive trends, so that it's exaggerated, but the correlation coefficient was 0.9982, okay, with an exponential. So that I can stick with the word exponential. And then, well, this is Australia. What's happening in the rest of the world? There was no collected database, so I just went looking for the American data. Did the same thing, not quite as exponential, but for a longer time period. And it was the level of debt was higher in 2005 than it had been since 1945. So I thought, well, this has got to be the biggest crisis. When this rate of debt can't keep on rising, when it stops rising, there'll be a crisis. Somebody has to warn about it, at least in Australia, I'm the somebody. So I started getting in touch with the media the next day. So that's the long story. So yes, I did. I didn't write published papers about it because I thought there's no time. I'm going to warn the public. By the time I get through a refereeing process, it'll already have happened. And partly one reason why I stuck my neck out was because I knew that the only way you could bring neoclassical economics down was through a crisis. But you wouldn't be listened to after the crisis if you hadn't said something about it before the crisis. So that's why I stuck my neck out. Because what's happened is it's gone from neoclassical economists being asked about my opinions and saying Keynes in a minority of one. That's a quote from an article that I can't actually locate the article, whether it was one of Keynes in a minority of one. Now after it, Keynes didn't predict the crisis. Well, screw you, I did. You know, it's the nature of economics. It's not a very pleasant discipline, putting it mildly. Yeah. Okay. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you very much.